Zach, we are back and we are talking moves to make, the return of moves to make. We got 6 moves for you guys today. If you are trying to win your league, if you're a competitive team, we got you dialed in for the start of the season. If you want more help, head on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. And if you want that much more help sorting out your team, check out the YouTube description box or the pin comment below for details on how to get your very own roster reviewed by me or Zach. I do hope that y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below some moves you're trying to make and how we can help you make them. But with that said, Zach, let's get to the content that people came for. Get into your first move to make, helping people win their leagues this season.
Yeah, so that's the biggest point there, right? We are trying to help you win your league. You're going for the championship push. And so when I'm doing that, I'm making sure that I'm buying what I would perceive as undervalued vets to fill out my lineup and add depth. And I'm going to extrapolate on this point a little bit later in the video too as well. But we'll just keep it at surface level for now. You know, buying veteran players, Bob, especially over the age of 30, is not relatively hard in Dynasty Fantasy Football. I think there's definitely been momentum in the right direction to kind of course correct where we were even a year ago. And part of that is like, I think the Dynasty community is like figuring things out a little bit. You know, one of the things I hear a lot the last few months is like, trades are dead. And it's like, no, I think Dynasty people are just getting wiser to the process of Dynasty. And with that comes the not selling players just because not selling players just because they're older. And that's really something that's kind of swung in the right direction over the last year or two, because, you know, you want to buy veterans that can score points and win you games. And some people like to trade those players in the name of youth and draft capital. But in this position, I'm trying to make a championship push. And Bob, you're somebody that's in a couple leagues with me, so you've seen me do some of these moves. But there's players like Brandon Cooks, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Hopkins. You highlighted Raheem Mostert just last week. These are players that are easy buys right now in most leagues, given that the right owners want to sell. There are other players that are not 30 years old. There's Alvin Kamara. There's Deontay Johnson, another player that we talked about last week, that are still not appropriately priced for their expected production in 2024. And so I think that this is something that people that are trying to win championships, they have to come around to. They have to understand that you are not going to win a championship more than likely with players 25 and under. You know, most players in their prime in the NFL are over the age of 25. You know, I know maybe not at the running back position, but certainly quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers, so on and so forth. They're in their prime, 26, 27, 28 years old. And we, for some reason, and I get it. I get it because I was there too. I was a dynasty owner that's like 26, I'm out. And that's just not the right approach. You know, you learn with the experience, you get wiser as the years come. But if we're going for a championship, go out there, see if you can buy some of these players. I bought Brandon Cooks in our Rewinders League for a 4th round pick. Did that at the rookie draft. You can get Derrick Henry right now, probably for a 2nd round pick plus something a little bit extra. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins, I don't know what the price is on him, but it can't be that expensive. He's a 32-year-old wide receiver. But he's still somebody that I'm expecting to give me top 25 production at the position. And then Raheem Mostert, I mean, we talked about him last week, RB2 last year. I don't care about Devon Achane and Jalen Wright being there. The Dolphins told you we like this guy. We're going to give him more money to stick around. They extended him. They gave him a raise. They don't do that to just not give him carries. Maybe he's not RB2, but can he be top 15? 100%. You want players in those offenses too. You know, I know that the channel is not like a Ricky Pearsall guy, but I was like, I just want a part of that offense, whether it's this year or 2 years from now. Like, he's a part of that offense. Somehow, some way, they're going to have to pay Brock Purdy. I don't think Samuel and Ayuk are there in 2 years. Just give me a part of that offense one way or the other. It's the same with Raheem Mostert. Do I expect RB2 production? No, but give me some of that offense. Give me the veteran on my team that can help me score points and win games. I'm a big fan of buying veterans on the teams that make sense, Bob. Again, I'm going for a championship push. I'm gonna dive into this even deeper in another one of my points, but I don't think you can win championships without exposing yourself to some veteran players because they are going to score points.
I love this point. This is something we've definitely hammered this offseason, is going after some of these aging vets to fill out your lineup, not necessarily to be your number one 2 or number 1 running back, number 1 wide receiver, you get it. But guys that can really help flush out your lineup, give you a little bit of depth, whatever the case is. And, you touched on it too with some of these aging vets. One of the best things you can do is, yes, it's great to get out before that cliff of value comes and selling them before they hit that, 28, whatever the cliff comes at value wise, sell before then. But if you can't, it's a great process to buy back in on these guys after the cliff hits, after their value cliff hits, because after the value cliff, they're still producing. Their production cliff comes after the value cliff, and that's where there's a nice bit of value for you and your starting lineups. But with that said, Zach, we'll move right along to my next one. This is a point that another point I think we've talked about a good bit this offseason in our, what we trade our first and second round picks for, rookie picks for, selling overhyped rookies for higher end proven commodities. And this goes for 3 players in particular that I'm looking to sell: Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy. Guys I like, not bad players. Guys that I just don't believe are going to be super helpful if you are trying to compete this year and you are expecting them to be in your starting lineup. That's the big caveat. I'm not selling these guys if I'm not really looking to utilize them as starters consistently. But sell them for guys that they're closely valued to: DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman Jr., Mark Andrews. Just 3 guys that you might not even need to add a whole bunch onto to go get to make the pivot. Makes you much more secure in your starting options. And I get planning for the future is fun. It's Dynasty. We want to, play Dynasty GM on Madden. That's all we want to do. We want to have this long-standing Dynasty that lasts forever. But if you want to win a championship, you're going to need to pass on some of this young, unproven upside that is fun and sexy and new and interesting for some boring old production that we know that is good for our teams. DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Mark Andrews, all secure sources of production. These are also options that help you in the future. They're not 34 years old or anything like that. They're just going to help you a lot more right now with your starting lineup without the question marks the rookie possess, and they're going to give you a few years yet. They're not, going to age out of the league anytime super soon. So let me start by adding a 3rd round pick to any of these rookies if I even have to. And if I had to add a 2nd to get a 3rd back with these pivots, I'm more than happy doing so. If you wanted, you could take a swing at some higher end options like Chris Olave or Drake London. If you're willing to add a 1st to these rookies, you could do that. And I mentioned this a little bit, but I really want to hammer this point home is this isn't a move you have to make. Like if these guys aren't in your starting lineup that you're projecting, hey, trying to set those lineups ahead of time, see where things shake out. Zach, you're going to kind of talk about this in the next point. These rookies aren't in your starting lineup consistently, where they're just bench depth, bye week fill-in, whatever the case is. You don't have to make these moves. But if these are guys that you're lining up as your wide receiver 3, not even a flex option, I'd highly suggest making some of these pivots instead of relying on these rookies in your starting lineup. Zach, feel free to touch on this before you get into your next point.
Look, I think what you're trying to say is sell the hype for a safer floor, which is usually a good idea.
Even
because, well, yeah, but like DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Mark Andrews, they have a safe floor.
Sure.
And it's high. It's high, but they have a safe floor. You don't know what that is with Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy. When you're not moving one of those for one of the proven guys, it's because you believe that they're going to outperform the other guys, whether it's this year or whether it's in the future. But we're trying to win a championship right now. We're trying to make our team the best it can possibly be in 2024. So, I mean, these are the names you pulled are great names for this point, by the way. Like, they're not sexy. Well, Mark Andrews is sexy, but even still, he's lost a little bit of luster. Not sure. Mark Andrews, the guy. Mark Andrews, the fantasy player. They're not the most interesting fantasy players, but they are players that you don't think about. You just put them in your starting lineup, and you don't worry. And if anything, you get a breakout week, and sure, you'll get a bust week here or there, but no player is safe from that. So this is a great point. And again, part of what I'm doing in this video is giving the Dynasty community props because I've seen, and I think that we're getting to the point now where people are wising up to the fact like, hey, not all these rookies are going to hit. So I love this point. This is a great one. And I think the names that you brought up are phenomenal. Like, we're not saying sell Brian Thomas Jr. for Terry McLaurin, because I wouldn't feel really good about that. These are players that you can feel really good about starting in your lineup, and even for a few years to come. Like, they're not that old. They're still young guys, and they have a safe floor, and they have the potential for a high ceiling. So I really like this point, but I like it more because of the names that you provided in terms of the players that we would buy here, Bob.
not just selling for the sake of selling to
Correct. Yes.
get into those better situations. At least for right now, I I'm not going to say I like Brian Thomas Jr. as much as the next guy, but Lad McConkey, Xavier Worthy, guys, I'm very much in on and like long term, but just guys I don't love this year. If I'm trying to compete, I'm trying to make these pivots. Zach, you have a great move you're going to talk about here. Very nuanced, very talked about, underutilized. Dive on in.
Yeah, look, this is my third year on the channel, and I'll talk about this point every single season because it's so important. And it can really be the difference between you being a Final Four team automatically because you get a bye and you not making the playoffs. And that's what I call biodiversity, not biodiversity, biodiversity. Let's put that on a t-shirt.
I love that.
Yeah, there we go. Look, your competitive team, things are not going to go as planned. What am I doing? This is like the dead part of the fantasy season, right? So what am I doing? I'm really taking a look at my opponents, especially what I call the repeater opponents, the three teams that I play again. How did they fare last season? How tough does my end of the season schedule look like? And what does my bye schedule look like as it aligns with those last 3 or 4 weeks? Really, what we got to look at for 2024, buys change every single year. How many teams, who, when, what. Really, what we're going to have to look at, Bob, is the end of the fantasy season. From week 11 to week 14, mind you, week 13, there are no buys. But just in those 3 weeks alone, half of the NFL teams are not playing a game of football. And that is the crunch time of your fantasy season. It is the last few games before the playoffs. And as I said, that could be the difference between you making the playoffs or you having a first-round bye or you not making the playoffs at all. So paying attention to this now. And I'm not saying you can't do this during the season. And even as you get to week 9 and 10, you absolutely still do this. It just gets harder to do it as you approach that. But what am I doing now? I'm preparing for that. I'm preparing for the end of the season. Like, let's look at some of these teams real quick, and then I'll dive into a few more points. Week 12, Falcons, Bills, Bengals, Jaguars, Saints, Jets. There are a lot of fantasy-relevant players on those teams. That's 6 teams in Week 12. Week 14, Ravens, Broncos, Texans, Colts, Patriots, and Commanders. Still a lot of fantasy-relevant players on there. Look at the quarterbacks in play. Lamar Jackson, C.J. Stroud, Anthony Richardson. That's very, very high-profile players that you are not going to have the last week of the regular season. How important is it to know that now, to have a plan in place? Take a look at your opponents. How do their bye weeks match up against yours? I don't want to be in a situation, Bob, where I have 4 players on a bye and my opponent has none. And it might happen to you, but what's worse is to not be prepared for it. And we talked about earlier, you talked about selling rookies for proven commodities. I talked about buying older players. Both of those points come into play in this one. You need to have players that you feel comfortable slotting into your starting lineup in case you have a bye week. You know, a good one last week that I could think of was like a Curtis Samuel. He was a safe 10 points almost every single week. And that's what I'm looking for. That's all I want. Please, can you give me double-digit points this week? That's all I need from you. The rest of my team will do their thing. You do your thing. It's like, every team when there's an injury, next man up. It's the same thing on my fantasy team. Next man up, man. I'm not worried about that bye week. Let's go. We got Curtis Samuel coming off the bench. By the way, Curtis Samuel's probably going to have a nice little season. Again, if you find yourself in a position week of and you're scrambling for 1 or 2 players to fill in adequately at certain positions, Bob, that's leverage that you've given to your opponent and to your league mates in negotiations. It's not a big one, but it's a small one. And the smarter people will capitalize on that. And somebody like me will tell you in a trade negotiation, you need this trade. You need it. Not all people are keen on those things, but that's something that I will pick up. I will look at my opponent saying, why are they trying to buy this player this week? Why did they try to buy them a month ago? Why not 2 months ago? So a couple things here, Bob, and then I'll wrap this up. Before the season, right now, I'm looking for players that could fill in on my roster in case of injuries or bye weeks, and I'm looking for double-digit points as a floor. You can wait until in season to make moves, as some teams will become sellers, of course. Weeks 8 or 9, there's some teams that are out of it. But the most important thing for this is if you're going to do that, Bob, be the first and the most frequent person knocking on their door and just drop a friendly reminder. Say, hey, if you're selling player X, can you reach out to me and let me know, not necessarily can I match an offer, but I'd like to know if this player becomes available because I am interested.
I really like this point, Zach. It's very nuanced, very in-depth in the nitty-gritty of dynasty strategy. Something I like to implement, trading, later in the seasons, trading those late season buys like you kind of touched on for players who've already had their bye weeks. And the
Oh
big
man, that's a
caveat,
good one. That's a good
the
one.
the big caveat with this too is though, because you also said this is that bye weeks change every year. It's not going to be the same year for every player. They're not going to shake up the same way on your teams. And ultimately, the bye week issue that is in front of you is a limited time issue. You don't want to make a trade that's going to hurt you long term. So any trades you make, you still want to make sure the value is still right. You don't want to just make a trade to fix, put a band-aid on something and then it just starts bleeding after the season because you made a horrible trade, whatever the case is. But that's something I like doing, trading those late season buys after my bye week has already come and gone for a player. Again, it's something people can pick up on and might notice if they're thinking that far ahead.
A lot of people
But guess
don't.
what? You're
A lot of
tuning into
people
the
don't.
right channel, and a lot of you are in the know on some of those little nuanced things. But that's definitely something I like to try to implement, trading those later season buys after or for players whose buys have already come and gone, and that kind of keeps you a little fresh in the buy department as well, and gives you something of note worth buying for them, even if it's going to open up a bye week hole for them. It's still something that you're not just throwing a pick at them. They're not getting a player back. It's something, that we touch on in season. Players are the most valuable thing until teams turn into sellers. Another thing you touched on, players are the most valuable thing because players are what create points, and we need points right now. Picks don't make points right now unless you trade the picks for points. But either which way, those would be my only two additions. Don't make any, short-term moves that fix the short-term problem, but create long-term issues. That's just a good rule of thumb in general, but especially for just trying to solve any bye week problems that are upcoming. Zach, it's a great point overall. Definitely want to keep an eye on those bye weeks. Keep your eye on the ball as best you can for what's ahead. And then you'll be that much more ahead of your league mates when the time comes. The next thing I'm doing as a quote unquote competitive team or a team that's looking to win a championship this year, I'm pivoting off highly valued players in poor situations for similar value in better situations. And this is where I'm looking at players who are still highly valued in the dynasty community, and I just kind of see them and I'm like, why? And one screaming player that does that for me right now is Tank Dell, who is wide receiver 20 on Keep Trade Cut, despite, in my opinion, being the wide receiver 3 on his own team. Behind Nico Collins, behind Stephon Diggs, you have Tank Dell. And I know Tank Dell did a lot of great things last year, but at this point, this valuation is just too rich for me. If you're thinking that there are going to be 3 wide receiver 2s in that offense, I don't know about that. I don't feel good about that. That's not something that happens super frequently. I know CJ Stroud is the next coming of Christ in fantasy terms, but I can't quite get behind that. So the valuation is just a little rich for me. I'd rather use his value to pivot into a better situation this year. Someone who's not the third target in their respective receiving pecking order. Options like not a receiver, but Kyron Williams, a guy we both like. DK Metcalf, yes, again, going to DK Metcalf. Big DK Metcalf guy today. Or Dalton Kincaid, a tight end I know we both like as well. So there's just some options. But, the beauty of Dynasty is having the option to hold players for the long term. It's not like redraft every year. You draft a team, you dump them the following year or that offseason, not even just the following year. But that doesn't mean you have to hold them through thick and thin. There's no affinity between you and the player. Like at the end of the day, yes, we have our emotional players that we are attached to that we like better, but you don't have to hold him. There's nothing written in stone that's saying you have to. If his value wasn't this high, I wouldn't really care. I'd say whatever, just roll with him. If he was around a wide receiver 3 price tag, like a mid wide receiver 3 price tag, I wouldn't be in this suggestion. But these pivots are just so easy to make, and you likely don't have to add much of anything to these to Tank Dell to get these other players and get a deal done and improve your situation for the team this year. So Zach, what are your thoughts on moving off Tank Dell, the idea itself, and these targets? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm not totally against this. I get what you're saying about the Texans wide receiver room, and there's more mouths to feed than those 3. Also, there's still a couple guys there in that wide receiver room from last year. There's still Dalton Schultz. They brought in Joe Mixon as well, so there's a lot of mouths to feed in that offense. Man, our comment section, Tank Dell for Kyron Williams I could just see Nate
How
in
can you even
his
get mad?
his 6 different accounts. Like, what is wrong with you? I like that deal. I like that deal. There's been some situations where I have I have had 2 pieces on the Texans offense, and one of those being like Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz. Like, I don't want that situation because I don't want to be in a situation where, let's say the Houston Texans get shut out and I've got 2 pieces of that. I'm never like that. I don't care what offense it is. I want to remove myself from that risk of 2 players from the same offense busting on the same week. I'm with this one. Am I somebody that's seeking out trading Tank Dell? No, but I'm somebody that is putting him on the trade block to see if anybody's overly eager about moving him, or sorry, about acquiring him for a player like you've mentioned here. And for people who are wondering why we keep talking about DK Metcalf, he's put up very consistent numbers in a very not pass heavy offense, and I think that they're finally going to open some things up. I do expect them to have more 3 wide receiver sets. That's why I think Jackson Smith and Jigba will not be a terrible fantasy player this year, but I'm still expecting good things from DK Metcalf. So, yeah, I like these trades. I like this point. And it's good to put yourself in a situation when you're competing for a championship. See if you can capitalize off some of the hopium that some of these players have. Like you said, a Tank Dell had a phenomenal run last season. He's not somebody I'm trying to build my roster around. So if I can maneuver a trade and say, hey, are you interested in Tank Dell? Obviously he's a great player. We all like him, but I think we can all agree that you can pivot into something that can help your championship run a little bit better. And I'm with, Kyren Williams is going to have a good season. I don't care what anybody says. This is not Dameon Pierce 2.0. This is not Dameon Pierce 2.0. Look at everything that Sean McVay is saying and everything that he's done. Sean McVay is not somebody who lies to the media. It's never happened before. And he is saying that Kyren Williams is the guy. So love this trade. Love this point.
All right. So let's say you just put Tank Dell out on your trade block, Zach. Some completed trades today for Tank Dell. Devonta Smith. How do you feel about that? Straight up.
Wow.
I mean, that's not going to happen in your league. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry to tease you with that. Maybe more realistic. Saquon Barkley for Tank Dell, straight up.
I would do that. Yep.
Keon Coleman and a 25 second.
No, I'm not buying the Keon Coleman. I can't.
I'd be interested, to say the least, but I'll admit
I want a different player. I don't want Keon Coleman.
How about Jaden Reed?
No,
really? I thought that one would have got you.
No. Like you're trading for kind of the same situation. Tank Dell and Jaden Reed are their situations surrounding them is very similar. It's a prolific
with worse
offense
wide receivers in Green Bay.
Yes, but like better running backs.
Sure, I'll give you that. Tank Dell for a 25 first.
Not if that's a late first.
We will move right along then. That's just some offers you might have coming your way if you were to put Tank Dell up on your block, possibly get into some better situations. Zach, you were up next with another point, talking some more pivots here. What are you thinking? What do you got?
I'm trying to make a championship push, right? So I'm going to try and use injured players or underperforming players to package up and acquire starters for my push to a championship. Let's just go to last year. There were several key injured players early in the season, preseason, the first few weeks, and it will happen again. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen and who it's going to happen to. A couple of examples from last year, Bob, were Joe Burrow, Nick Chubb, Cooper Kupp, all suffered different severities of injuries, some season long, some a couple of weeks long, but they were key players that teams relied upon going into the season, and they were hurt early. Cooper Kupp was hurt before the season. He was on the PUP to start the year. Nick Chubb hurt week 2, and Joe Burrow in the middle of the season out for the rest of the year. So I'm looking to trade these players for something else that can help me score points and win games now. I know it's a redraft mentality, but at the end of the day, I like to win money. Money's good. I just had a baby. My wife likes to eat at Melting Pot. It's very expensive, even though she's not my wife yet, but she'll love that I said that. You may not recoup that value, but turning 0 points into starters is something that's absolutely possible with players of that caliber. Now, let me give you some examples, okay? This is what I love about Dynasty Daddy. Dynasty Daddy, you can search the time frame of when you want to look for a trade. So I looked for Nick Chubb the day after he was injured last year for the remainder of the week. Let me list you off some trades here. And keep in mind, we want to move a player that is out for the season for a player that I can put right into my starting lineup, Bob. Somebody moved Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry. I'm sorry, Nick Chubb and a second-round pick for Derrick Henry. Love it. It's a great trade. Somebody moved Nick Chubb for Tajay Spears and a third-round pick. That one paid off dividends in the second half of the year because you could play Tajay Spears. Someone traded Nick Chubb for Gus Edwards in a second. Holy moly, did that trade really work out? Because now you have potentially, still even into this season, a starting running back, and you picked up a 25 second. We also have Nick Chubb and a 26th third-round pick, Bob, for Isaiah Pacheco.
Love that.
Yeah. So these were the kinds of moves that you could have made last year, pivoting off a player that's they are no longer going to score points for you for the remainder of the season. I'm sure I could do this with Joe Burrow. I'm sure I could do this with Cooper Kupp and find trades that say I don't lose tremendous value. Some of these trades even gain value on the flip side, and still make sure that my starting lineup is adequate and giving me the best chance to win games.
It's so good to get players who are not scoring points for you off of your roster, especially when they still hold value. But my biggest thing is trying to get as much of that value back as you can. And one of the best ways to do that is to keep in mind who you're selling to instead of selling to other teams that are competing this year. Because there's going to be competitive teams, there's going to be teams in the middle, there's going to be teams that are already looking to next year as early as right now. So depending on when that injury happens, knowing who's in what bucket is going to be very important, because somebody who's not looking to next year will pay you more for a player who's out until next year than a player who wants to try to score points now, because that player is no good to them. That player who is not competing, the team who's not competing, to them is a better asset because they're getting them onto their roster for next year, probably at a slight discount still, but they're not putting points into their lineup either which way. So it's one of those things to how a possible trade partner is going to look at that player you're trying to sell. That's one way to try to get proper value best you can, or try to win the trade, quote unquote, win the trade in other ways where you're getting some value back. Picks wise, if you're not getting perfect player value back, try to get some value back in picks or something of that sort. Even if it's distant picks, something to, put cash in the till for later trades, etc. But ultimately, I'm a big proponent of, not having dead weight that can get you something on your roster off of your roster. If it has value but isn't putting points in your lineup and is just kind of taking up space, doesn't really need to be on my roster. And if I can get something better for it, by all means. And then just to tie in to that point a little bit, my last one, selling excess depth pieces for draft capital. Reason being is you're going to need to make moves during the season, plain and simple. The roster you walk into week 1 with will never be the roster you walk into your starting lineup week 17. It's just not going to happen. So don't blow your whole wad now. For starters, don't trade for all these aging vets now, because the last thing you want to do is spend all of your draft capital, all of your liquid assets for all of these admittedly older players that are valued, but also that have injury risk because they're just older. It's just naturally going to happen. And just in general, every player carries an inherent risk of injury. It's just fact of the matter is anybody can get injured. So save some draft capital. Don't make all of your moves now, as much as, we're going to be having moves to make leading up every week of the season, every week to the season, talking about different topics every week. Don't blow your entire wad now. Try to sell some of that excess depth you have for draft capital. Try to set those lineups now. Maybe play around with what your bye weeks look like Zach mentioned. Do you need some of those players for bye weeks? Are there some players kicking around that are injured or that you believe are going to underperform or who have underperformed in the past that might be another man's treasure, even though it's your trash? Can you get some draft capital to then later use for making deals later to another team, whatever the case is, to try to get some of this veteran depth that is so valuable, or any other piece that could just end up being roster depth for you? So that's just one thing to do with any excess depth you have. You might have excess depth, you might not. Fact of the matter is you just might not have a ton of depth kicking around. That's okay. But in those instances, especially, I recommend not blowing your whole wad before the season. Your whole wad meaning any liquidity you have in draft capital, extra players, etc. If you don't have good starting depth now, don't go selling all your pieces to make yourself thin. But if you do, another thing to do, go hit that waiver wire, see if you can add any hype that's, smoking during the preseason, during training camp. See if you can add any of these players to possibly flip to continue to increase your draft capital pool for trading later on in the season. Zach, feel free to touch on this before we get the heck on out of here.
Yeah, this is a good idea because you want to be in a spot where mid-season, late the season, when you're trying to do maybe some of the other things that we talked about earlier in this video, that you have capital to play with, that you have capital to make the moves. It's a soft spot of being in the right area at the right time of the season. You don't want to be a team that is, at week 10, week 11, you're trying to fill in some injury weeks, some bye weeks, and you have no draft capital to play with. You again, Bob, you're somebody in a league with me in the Rewinders League. I've been competing in that league for 2 years, 3 years now. I've sold my first round pick pretty early on, almost every single year, but I still have tons of thirds, fourth, and fifth round picks to be able to make moves, whether now in season, in the off season, et cetera, because I have the staples of my team. I have to be fluid from week to week. So, sometimes it's not even necessarily trading depth for you might have a hard time selling player X for a third round pick, but you could sell player X and a fourth for a third round pick and maneuver yourself up the draft board. And it also gives you opportunities to play the waiver wire right now. We talked about one of our other videos. I'm somebody that pays attention to training camp reports. I don't get hyped on the hopium, but I say, hey, look, again, I'm going to bring this name up. I have no idea what's going on in New Orleans, but some guy named Mason Tipton, a wide receiver from Yale, was talking at the podium today. That means something, in a wide receiver room where there's some depth to play with. So making a move like Bob talked about now frees up a spot for you to pick up a flyer on a Mason Tipton. And maybe nothing happens with him. Who knows? But it gives you flexibility. You got to be flexible in your dynasty roster. So maneuvering that championship path is, this week I'm doing this. This week I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to secure my bye weeks. I'm trying to acquire a fourth or a third round pick that I can spend later in the season when there's a team that's like, dude, I'm done this season. Let me get as much draft capital as possible. Let me sell Brandon Cooks. I have no use for Brandon Cooks, and he's the wide receiver 2 on Dallas. So I like this point because you're just trying to stay as fluid as possible so you can make the necessary moves when it's the right time for your team, Bob.
Yeah, I think some other good ways to add draft capital, making some small tier downs, nothing crazy, but take players who realistically are going to perform similarly numbers wise, but don't have the same hype as another player. Trade that player that has all the hype in the world, tier down, get a third round pick on top, something along those lines. And in all of your deals, Zach, going back to one of the first videos you were on with me, squeeze the juice from the orange. Try to get everything out of a trade that you can. Get a third round pick thrown in, get a fourth round pick thrown in. We know how easy it is to just, when you're on the cusp of being willing to make a deal already, add in that third round pick. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to take it off and send the offer back. Then you can send another trade with a fourth round pick in instead. And then the worst thing that's going to happen, they're either just not going to make the trade that you don't need to make to begin with, or they're going to accept the trade, or they're going to take off the fourth and send back the trade as it was. And then you accept it, call it a day, throw on some fab otherwise too. Worst case scenario, if you can't get the picks you want. But I hope you all get the picks you want, and I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below what moves you're trying to make and how we can help you make those moves. Heading over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. And if you want to make more moves with us, check out the roster review option in the pinned comment below. With all that said, Zach and I are going to get the heck on out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.